What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're finishing off the role guide series with a comprehensive guide to ADC for Smite Season 5, so let's get right into it. I was splitting the guide up into more manageable sections to make it a bit easier to understand, so in chronological order, this is what I'm going to be covering in the guide. First up, the very basics of what ADC is about. After that, we'll cover your role in the team comp. Next up, we'll take a look at what gods you should be looking at to take into the ADC role and what items you should be looking to build on them. Then we'll cover laning with your support and also laning on your own after the support leaves the lane. And finally, we'll cover what to do in late game team fights and your role in the team later on. So without further ado, let's kick off the guide with the basics of the role. The ADC in Smite is the quintessential carry role, and it's most known for its ability to carry games outright with the right assistance from the team. The ADC will mostly be dealing large amounts of sustained damage and DPS in late game team fights via auto attacks. This is opposed to high ability burst damage in team fights that will be brought by the mid laner, for example. Moving on to your role in the team. So as I briefly just mentioned, the ADC is usually the hard carry in quotes from the team. Hell, even C stands for carry in ADC. The ADC will often have quite a weak early game, but a monstrous late game damage output as a trade-off for that. Your role in the team as an ADC largely depends on what god you're playing, but for the most part you're at your strongest in the late game. So your role is to get there and dish out major damage in team fights to win them for your team. You are of course pretty easy to kill most of the time, which is where your other teammates come in. The support, sometimes the solo laner and even the jungler might need to do a little bit of peeling for you to draw attention away from you and allow you to get out your insane DPS pretty safely. So let's talk about gods and items for a bit. So as I briefly mentioned, the ADC role is mostly populated with auto attack gods, i.e. gods that use their basic attacks to deal most of the damage come late game. This mostly consists of hunters along with so-called magical ADCs like Sol, Kronos and Freya that use basic attacks quite a lot. You may see other gods picked outside of these, but for the most part these are the viable gods for ADC. Of course, there's a ton of variety within the hunter class itself. Some are more ability focused like Ula or Anhur, and some are more focused on their basic attacks for their damage like Artemis or Kernunos. These variations within the hunter class generally lead to different build paths as well, so let's move on to talking about items for a bit. I'll provide a few full builds for both ability based hunters and auto attack hunters, as well as magical ADCs like Freya and Kronos, but before all that, let's talk about starting builds for ADCs. For hunters, most of the time you want to start with Hunter's Blessing. The extra 15 auto attack damage helps so much for early game trading and even increases your clear speed quite a bit if you're landing a lot of auto attacks on the wave. You could argue for Mage's Blessing on ability based gods, but in my opinion the auto attack damage and attack speed is worth more overall for hunters in the laning phase. After the Blessing, you probably want to start your stacking item. Buying Spiked Gauntlet if you want Devourer's Gauntlets or Morningstar if you want Transcendence will allow you to get a head start on finishing your stacking item early. If you don't want to do that however, tier 1 boots will probably be your best option to get those done as fast as possible. Though I don't recommend just going boots in this current meta, stacking is just really powerful with how much free farm you get in lane, but it is an option open to you if you want to do that. And then fill up on potions with any remaining gold you have for some extra sustain in the lane. Another potential start is ditching the Blessing entirely and buying straight into the tier 2 of your stacking item and then potions. This hurts your early game a lot since you won't get all the bonuses from Hunter's Blessing, and you might get out traded by someone that has it, but it does let you get started with stacking super quick. I'm not a huge fan of this start really, as it's pretty risky without going the Blessing, but it's an option. For magical ADCs it's pretty similar. Usually you want Hunter's Blessing as well to compete with the enemy ADC's Blessing for boxing and things like that. From then you want to work into tier 2 of your stacking item, or Tiny Trinket if you want to rush Bancross Talon, or you could also go tier 1 boots if you wanted to, and fill up on potions. On the topic of boots, for hunters, both Warrior and Ninja Tabby are viable depending on what the rest of your build is going to be. If you're going heavily ability based with your items, you can get Ninja to pick up some extra attack speed. But if your build already includes plenty of attack speed and you're going to be nearing the cap anyway, go Warrior Tabby for the extra 40 damage it gives you, especially early game, it's pretty powerful. It is worth noting though that later on in the game, you might want to sell your Warrior Tabby for Ninja Tabby, as the extra 20% attack speed is worth more late game if you can fit it in your build. For magical ADCs, penetration boots are almost always what you want. The early game power and penetration is just too good for laning to pass up really, but if you really need the CDR and won't be getting anything elsewhere in terms of CDR, you can go cooldown boots if you want to. Alright, moving on to proper items. Since I can't cover builds for every ADC, I'm just going to list a few good items that are good on most hunters and then provide a full build example at the end, as well as a couple for magical ADCs as well. So for hunters, in this meta it's basically essential to stack as I mentioned before. So either Devourer's Gauntlets or Transcendence are both great right now for your stacking item depending on your god and your playstyle. After that, Executioner is great right now for penetration and just overall good stats. Assy and Bloodforge are good lifesteal options if you didn't build Devourer's Gauntlets earlier on. Kin Size is great, also if you're not getting Kin Size, you should probably go into crit items like Rage, Deathbringer, Wind Demon, even Malice and Poison stack can be okay in this meta. Titan's Bane can be good if you need extra penetration against tanks. Odysseus Bow is good if you need a big boost of attack speed in the build, and finally, Crusher is pretty good on ability based hunters. Other items than these can work, but these are the best and most popular items right now. Alright, so here's a few full build examples for hunters. For a Devourer's Gauntlets build, you obviously get Devourer's Gauntlets, Warrior Tabby, Executioner, kin size, Odysseus bow, and Titan's bane. For a crit version of this build, swap out the last 3 items for Poison Star, Wind Demon, and Deathbringer. And a Transcendence build, Transcendence, Ninja Tabi, Assi, Executioner, kin size, Titan's bane. As with the first build, you can swap out kins and titans for some crit items if you want to. And for magical ADCs, for Freya, Penetration Boots, Bancroft's Talon, Demonic Grip, Hasten Ring, Typhon's Fang, Obsidian Shard. For Kronos, Warlock's Staff, Penetration Boots, Demonic Grip, Bancroft's Talon, Telkine's Ring, Rod of Tahuti. And for Sol, Bancroft's Talon, Penetration Boots, Warlock's Staff, Demonic Grip, Soul Reaver, Obsidian Shard. Alright, that wraps up the items section, so let's move on to the laning phase. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to be splitting this section up into 2 smaller subsections. We're going to talk first about the duo lane experience, laning with the support, and then afterwards we'll talk about laning 1v1 just versus the enemy ADC after the support leaves the lane. So for a good portion of the laning phase this season, the support will be with you in lane. How long this is really depends on the support and how they like to play, but for at least a while you'll be laning with the support. So try and learn how they like to play and their general mannerisms so you can make a cohesive duo lane with them. The first thing you need to be doing every single game is looking at your gods. This means both you and your support, and how you work together with them. Certain god combos have obvious synergy, like Athena Medusa or Sobek Anher, but I mean just in general how you need to be playing relative to your enemies. Even if you're a really defensive late game ADC like Artemis, you might still want to be prepared to make some aggressive plays if your support tends to be more aggressive like an Ares or something. It's also important to look at the enemy combination and analyse how you stack up against them in terms of lane clear, 2v2 boxing, invades, etc. and then play accordingly to that. If you go into the lane knowing you should outclear the enemy, you can plan ahead and try and poke at the first wave a lot, so when you clear you can aggress and land a first blood or get some invades, stuff like that. This phase of the lane is really all about working with your support rather than against them. I see a ton of players in both roles, to be honest, that refuse to bend their normal playstyle just a little bit to fit with their lane partner, and it just ends up being their downfall because they're both trying to do different things. Just get on a level and try to play with your support as best you can. It's not always possible 100%, but just try. In terms of laning on your own, once the support starts to rotate, this section of the laning phase is where your mechanics as a hunter player become way more important and where you can shine. You don't have the support to land CC or soak up damage, so you have to be able to land your own abilities without setup, and same thing with auto attacks. This type of skill obviously comes with time, and the more you play the role and hunters in general, you'll get better at this 1v1 boxing match that happens with the enemy ADC. As you get left alone in lane, this is prime time to start power farming as well. You'll get entire waves to yourself, and you can often get a few jungle camps in between as well, which allows you to start spiking and farm and snowball into those later stages where you're at your most powerful. The support rotating is a really good time to turn the lane in your favour if you are behind coming in from a 2v2, as you're relying solely on your own individual skill, and if you're ahead coming in, there's a chance you can even further your lead, so make sure you abuse what lead you have in the 1v1. And try and take fights with the enemy ADC as much as possible if you're ahead or vastly better than them. Likewise, if you're behind coming into it, then play it safe and try to avoid boxing the enemy, because they'll be doing the same thing to you that I just mentioned you should be doing to them. Just play it safe, clear waves, and try and get extra farm where you can. Maybe you can get a gank from support and jungle or mid or something if you're really struggling and getting zoned out. A quick tip if you struggle with hitting auto attacks in a 1v1. If you find yourself missing a few autos in a row, stop holding down the left mouse button constantly for a second and just line up the auto attacks properly. A lot of people seem to hit 2 or 3 autos and then assume they have god aim and just go full auto, hold down left click, and then miss the next 4 or 5 auto attacks and lose the trade. Just make sure you're aiming each auto attack individually and not necessarily firing at max attack speed all the time. In general, early on it's way better to just tap fire than hold down the trigger, as you'll land them way more often and it also slows you down less. Item power spikes are also a really important thing to recognise in the 1v1 laning phase, even more than 2v2. Pay attention to the enemy's items as well as yours. If the enemy backed and finished their full executioner but you only have a balance blade, you should probably avoid boxing them until you can get your executioner done, and otherwise you'll be at a severe pen disadvantage. Likewise, if you recall and finish a full item, you'll probably want to try and take trades, especially if you finish an item that the enemy doesn't have yet. Anything that gives you an advantage in the 1v1 boxing fights is great. If you're an item up on someone, it can make up for a pretty big mechanical skill gap, and you can even win trades just because you have an item up on them. And finally, let's close out the guide with a bit about team fighting and late game team play. The ADC is extremely important in late game team fights. After all, it's where they're designed to shine. Target priority is really important in team fights as an ADC due to your insanely high DPS and sustained damage output compared to other classes. Obviously the best targets are things like the enemy mage and hunter, as they deal the most amount of damage for the enemy team, but a lot of the time there's a wall of tanks and junglers sitting between you and them, so don't be afraid to target a tank if they're just sitting there in front of you and you can't get to a better target. You'd be surprised how quickly you melt through tanks with executioner, even better if you have kin size. Your main priority should be keeping yourself safe in a fight. Try to always be thinking about if going in for that one kill would put you in too much danger and end up killing yourself. You're a huge portion of your team's DPS in fights as well as out of fights. You're easily the most important character when it comes to burning down objectives. Without the ADC alive, your chances of getting a fire giant post-fight are drastically reduced. Of course, the support and sometimes other members of the team will be there some of the time to peel for you, but they won't always be there, so you will need to self-peel sometimes. Some ADCs do it better than others, but all of them can keep themselves alive in a fight somewhat effectively. Try to isolate enemies into a 1v1 scenario if you can. Few characters in the game can beat a late game ADC in a 1v1 fight. The way you lose is by multiple enemies jumping on you at once, as your single target damage is less useful in that scenario, so if you see someone off on the sidelines, try and call for an attack and single them out, especially if it's an enemy carry like ADC or mid. Taking them out of the fight can drastically increase your odds of winning, but of course, as I mentioned before, try and keep yourself alive, as towers, phoenixes, fire giants, and even titan pushes are much more successful with you there than not. But anyway, that rounds out the guide. Hope you guys enjoyed and learnt something from it. If you did, then be sure to share it around with anyone you think could benefit. This is the final role guide, so let me know what other guides or educational content you guys want to see from me in the future alongside my other stuff. But that's about it. Catch you guys in the next video. Peace out, nerds.